Hi, welcome back. If you watched my last video, which was the basics of outlining and flooding a sugar cookie, then this is another beginner level cookie. So today we're going to be talking about craters. And if you don't know what a crater is yet, that's totally perfect. This is the video for you. And I made a cookie last night that I flooded without following any of this advice, hoping that I would get craters, so I can show you what it is. So this is what we're talking about today. Do you see that little... It's probably not focusing, but do you see those little holes? Those are craters. Okay, so here you can actually see what a crater is a little bit better. And so sometimes it'll just be where your icing will kind of sink in the center as it dries, and other times you'll actually get a hollowing hole, like you see more so on this side. Sometimes it's totally open, and it just doesn't look very nice. So let's get into some of the tips and tricks that we can try to avoid craters. So all of my cookies have been pre-flooded with a base layer of icing. So it's kind of close to the cookie color, but you can see when I turn the cookie here that there is a base layer of flood on it. So what we're doing today is going to be the second layer of icing, which is what you would see in pink. So probably the most common tip that I hear would be to begin your second layer, this pink layer, when your first layer is not yet completely dry. So if you flood it and you just kind of let it sit to the side under a fan for maybe like 10-20 minutes where it's crusted over, but it's not 100% dry, and that's when you would start your second layer. Some people will say that that works pretty good for them to prevent craters. I don't tend to use that, only because often I will flood all of my cookies the night before, and then I'm just done for the day and I want to move on to the next step the next day, in which case they're going to be fully dry. And sometimes you need the base layer to be fully dry. Like if you're going to be doing some watercolor painting on it, like let's say the back of this was going to have some watercolor painting design that you do with your food coloring. It has to be fully dry before you do that. Or if you're going to be using an edible ink marker or pen on it, it has to be fully dry. So sometimes you need that base layer to be fully dry before you go in with your second layer. So we're going to talk about some other tips that you can do when your base layer is fully dry, as well as if it had just only crusted over. Okay, so I tend to use 2 icing consistencies because I'm using typically the icing that I've been using when I'm flooding. So for example, in the last video, we outlined and flooded these little heart cookies. I'm using the same outline and flood consistency that I have already to do this next cookie. You could make a different consistency for this, which some people will recommend using, which is basically to use a flood that is as thick as it can possibly be while still being able to smooth it out with your scribe, with wiggling your scribe. So we'll do that at the end. I'll show you an option of doing that at the end, or just using your outline consistency to fill it in. But usually I'm using 2 consistencies, which is my outline and my flood. And so that's what we're gonna do today. So this is a little X and an O because it's Valentine's Day that we're working on. And so I'm just going to do my outline to begin with of the design. Okay, so one option that some people like to do is poking holes before they flood it. And so generally you'll just take your scribe and you'll just, it's gonna hold my cookie in place, but you'll just poke holes in that base layer before you go over and flood that. And then you would take your flood consistency and fill that in. That works for some people really well. The other thing that some people will do is they'll take their outline consistency and they will do a little kind of squiggle line through an area that's likely to crater, and then they'll flood on top of that. What I like to do I've tried both of these, and I have found personally that I still crater with both of these options, but you may not. I think there's a lot of variables that go into whether or not it craters, and it could be the recipe you're using, it could be the consistency you're using, it could be the environment around where you are, humidity level, whether you're putting your cookie in a dehumidifier, sitting it in front of a fan. There's so many different factors. But for me personally, my consistency, my recipe, my environment, I crater with both of these. And so what I have found the most reliable way for me to not crater is I will essentially take my outline consistency and pretty much fill in almost the whole area with a good amount of outline. Okay, so I've got like almost that whole area filled with outline, and then I'll take my flood icing, and I'm really just gonna use, if I use too much flood, even on top of this, it'll still crater. So I just wanna use enough that I can smooth out a coat on top of that and kind of bring it over to the edges without kind of going overboard. So I'm gonna do a layer of my flood on top of this big poofy layer of my outline. And then I'm gonna use my scribe to pull my looser consistency flood icing over top of that outline icing consistency that's in the center and bring it down to the base. And that way I'll get a nice smooth finish on top. But because there's a really thick amount of outline icing underneath, it doesn't seem to crater. Because cratering tends to happen more so the looser your icing is when you're working in a narrow area. If I were to fill this in completely with my outline icing, it would not crater. For me, it would not crater. But my outline icing in an area the size of this, it would be pretty difficult for me to get this nice smooth finish. For me, I need to have a flood on there to get a nice smooth finish. If I were working in an area smaller like this, actually probably more like this side, and I filled it with a big amount of my outline consistency, I could probably smooth that out with jiggling it with my scribe. But this size, I need a flood to be able to get it smooth. So those are the main, these two are the main two that I see, combined with putting your second layer on when the first layer isn't fully dried. But my preference tends to be this option here. That's just what works best for me. And so just practice all of them, because like I said, there's a lot of factors that go into what works, and what's my preference might not be what's your preference, and there's no right or wrong way to do any of this. So try them out, and then I'm gonna switch cookies and show you one other option for avoiding craters. Okay, so we're gonna mix some icing here. So when my icing comes out of my mixing bowl, this is the consistency that it is at based on my recipe. So this is generally my outline consistency, and then I will loosen it up until it settles out nice and smoothly on its own for my flood consistency. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna do the option I talked about where you use a consistency that is not quite a flood, but will smooth out with some jiggling, which for me, this won't yet. So we're gonna put a tiny bit of water in here until we get that consistency where I can jiggle it. I'll show you right now, like if I jiggle this, it's not gonna smooth out in here. So we're gonna add a little bit of water. So if we're working in a really small area right now, what I want to see is if I were to jiggle my scribe in it, would that smooth out? And I don't know if you saw, there was a little bit there and it did smooth out. And so same with here. If I jiggle it, can I get it to smooth out? Yes, I can. So this is kind of that consistency where it's still an outline. It wouldn't really flood nicely, but If I'm working in a really like small enough area, I can probably jiggle my scribe and get it to smooth out. Okay, so here we have these tiny leaves or these tiny roses, and we're gonna be using the green we just mixed to do the little leaves on these roses. And so the purpose of this, the reason we did that is because the thicker the consistency your icing is, the less likely it is to crater, okay? So the thicker you can get it, the better your chances are at it not cratering. So this is the example where we're going to use one consistency only, and it's going to be basically an outline consistency that we've watered down just slightly enough to where we can smooth it out, but it wouldn't be considered a flood, okay? And so we're going to take that and we're going to kind of outline where we want the leaf to be. And then I'm going to fill that area in with that outline consistency. And then, so you can see this is not self-settling on its own the way that the flood does. But with a little bit of jiggling and playing around, we can typically get a small area like this to smooth out. But you can see like it takes a bit of effort even on a small area, and this is why I personally don't use a thicker consistency to flood larger areas, because I have a really hard time getting large areas really nice and smooth. But if we work at this long enough, we can get a small area smooth. Okay, not bad. So there you go. That's the final option for preventing craters, is just using the thickest consistency that you possibly can. Okay, so that's it for today. If you enjoyed these tutorials, I would love for you to subscribe and stay tuned for lots more.